Good evening, history enthusiasts and lovers of imperial dysfunction. Tonight, we're diving into one of Rome's most spectacular train wrecks, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known as Caligula, a nickname that roughly translates to Little Boots, which is adorable until you realize this was the guy who allegedly tried to wage war against the god of the sea. Now, here's the thing about Caligula. His story sits at that perfect intersection where historical documentation meets absolute chaos, where eyewitness accounts collide with propaganda, and where even serious historians throw up their hands and say, look, we're not entirely sure what happened, but it was definitely weird. The good news is that Caligula started his reign in 37 CE as Rome's golden boy, young, charismatic, son of the beloved military hero Germanicus, and initially so popular that Romans literally sacrificed 160,000 animals in celebration when he took power. The bad news is that what followed was roughly 3 years and 10 months of what can only be described as a masterclass in how to lose friends and terrify people. We're talking about an emperor who allegedly declared himself a living god, had conversations with statues, invited his horse to dinner parties with more enthusiasm than he showed for the Senate, and generally treated the Roman Empire like it was his personal reality show centuries before reality television was invented. Born on August 31st, 12 CE, in Antium, modern-day Anzio, Italy, little Gaius had the kind of childhood that would make any therapist reach for a larger notepad. His father Germanicus was Rome's military superstar, the kind of general who won battles and hearts with equal efficiency, while his mother Agrippina, the elder, was tough as nails and politically savvy. Young Gaius spent his early years traveling with his father's legions along the Rhine frontier, where soldiers found him so adorable in his miniature military uniform, complete with tiny boots, hence Caligula, that they adopted him as their unofficial mascot. Imagine being a battle-hardened Roman legionary going soft over a toddler in combat gear. That's the origin story we're working with here. Everything was relatively normal until Gaius was 7, when his father mysteriously died in Syria in 19 CE, possibly poisoned on orders from Emperor Tiberius, who saw Germanicus as a political threat. Suddenly, our little military mascot became the son of a martyr, which sounds noble until you realize it painted a massive target on his entire family's back. Agrippina, convinced Tiberius had murdered her husband, spent the next several years openly feuding with the emperor because subtlety was apparently not a family trait. This is roughly the equivalent of publicly accusing your boss of murder and expecting your performance review to go well. Spoiler alert, it did not go well. Tiberius eventually exiled Agrippina and her 2 oldest sons, where they died under suspicious circumstances, starvation, forced suicide, the usual Roman family drama. By the time Caligula hit his teenage years, he'd watched his father die mysteriously, his mother get exiled, and his brothers perish in what were clearly not accidents. The survival strategy he developed was essentially becoming whatever Tiberius wanted him to be, a political chameleon with spectacular self-preservation instincts. At 19, he was summoned to live with Tiberius on the island of Capri, which was like getting invited to your paranoid uncle's isolated compound, except your paranoid uncle happens to be the most powerful man in the world and has already killed most of your family. Historians note that during this period, Caligula showed remarkable restraint and adaptability, never once giving Tiberius reason to suspect he harbored any resentment about, the whole dead family situation. Tiberius, despite being suspicious of literally everyone, apparently grew fond of Caligula, or at least fond enough not to have him killed, which was basically the Roman imperial equivalent of a 5-star endorsement. The ancient historian Suetonius claims Tiberius once remarked that he was nursing a viper for the Roman people, which is the kind of foreshadowing that makes you want to yell at historical figures like they're characters in a horror movie. But Tiberius named Caligula joint heir with his own grandson Tiberius Gemellus, and when the old emperor finally kicked the bucket in March of 37 CE, possibly with some assistance from Caligula himself, depending on which ancient source you trust, our 24-year-old survivor inherited the most powerful position on earth. What could possibly go wrong with giving absolute power to a traumatized young man who'd spent his formative years watching tyranny in action? The first months of Caligula's reign were genuinely promising, which makes what came later even more baffling to historians. He granted bonuses to the military, recalled political exiles, abolished certain taxes, sponsored spectacular games, and generally behaved like the benevolent ruler everyone hoped he'd be. Romans were ecstatic, finally believing they had an emperor who combined youth, energy, and the beloved Germanicus's bloodline without Tiberius's paranoid cruelty. Ancient sources describe him as generous, witty, and genuinely popular during this honeymoon period. For about 6 months, it seemed like the Roman Empire had hit the jackpot. Young, handsome emperor with impeccable lineage who actually liked people and threw great parties. This is the equivalent of finally getting that cool new boss who promises to modernize everything and actually seems to mean it. Then something shifted. In October of 37 CE, roughly 6 months into his reign, Caligula fell seriously ill with what historians speculate might have been encephalitis, severe epilepsy, or possibly poisoning. Ancient sources aren't exactly helpful here, offering descriptions that range from brain fever to divine punishment. Rome held its collective breath, with some citizens reportedly vowing to sacrifice their own lives if the emperor recovered, which seems excessive but was apparently genuine Roman devotion. Caligula did recover, but according to ancient historians, something fundamental had changed. Whether the illness damaged his brain, whether it triggered a psychological break from years of suppressed trauma, or whether this is when he realized that absolute power meant absolutely no consequences, we'll never know for certain. What we do know is that the emperor who emerged from that sickbed was not the same person who entered it. After his recovery, Caligula's behavior shifted from conventionally generous to spectacularly bizarre. He executed his adopted grandson and co-heir Tiberius Gemellus on charges of conspiracy, which eliminated the only person with a competing claim to the throne and set a precedent for casual violence. He began spending Rome's treasury with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for lottery winners with poor impulse control, funding elaborate building projects, hosting games so expensive they'd make modern Super Bowl budgets look frugal, and generally treating imperial finances like an infinite money glitch in a video game. His relationship with the Senate deteriorated from respectful to openly contemptuous, with reports of him humiliating senators for entertainment, which is definitely one way to build workplace morale if your goal is universal terror. The weirdness escalated throughout 38 and 39 CE. Caligula announced plans to build a bridge of boats across the Bay of Baiae, about 2 miles, just so he could ride across it wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate, because apparently proving you could walk on water was peak emperor behavior. He started appearing in public dressed as various gods: Venus, Apollo, Jupiter, which was either a bold fashion statement or genuine delusion, depending on your interpretation. Reports suggest he had full conversations with the moon, invited her to his bed, and claimed Jupiter spoke to him regularly, which is the kind of thing that might get you a medical evaluation today, but in ancient Rome just meant you had really committed to the whole divine emperor concept. When people tell you absolute power corrupts absolutely, Caligula is basically exhibit wearing a god costume and arguing with celestial bodies. His expenditures became so legendary that he allegedly bankrupted Rome's treasury within the first year. No small feat considering the empire's wealth. To replenish funds, Caligula got creative in ways that made Tiberius's fiscal conservatism look quaint. He instituted new taxes on everything from lawsuits to prostitution, held rigged auctions where attendees accidentally bought items for absurd prices after nodding off, and allegedly opened a brothel in the imperial palace staffed by senators' wives to generate revenue, which is definitely not covered in any ethical leadership handbook. He also brought back treason trials with enthusiasm, discovering that conveniently accusing wealthy citizens of crimes against the state was an excellent fundraising strategy when their estates got seized. It was basically a government-run protection racket, where the emperor was both the mob boss and the law. The relationship between Caligula and Rome's elite had become purely transactional and transparently hostile. Senators who'd initially celebrated his ascension now lived in constant fear. never knowing if they'd be honored at dinner or accused of conspiracy before dessert. The emperor seemed to delight in their discomfort, occasionally forcing elderly senators to run alongside his chariot or making them perform degrading tasks for his amusement. This wasn't just political calculation anymore. It was personal entertainment with deadly consequences, as if he'd turned the Roman Senate into his own private reality show where elimination meant actual elimination. And throughout all this chaos, there was one relationship that remained consistently positive: his bond with a horse named Incitatus, which brings us to the most famous story of Caligula's reign and the reason we're all here tonight. The horse in question, Incitatus, whose name translates to swift or at full gallop, lived better than approximately 99% of Roman citizens, which tells you everything about Caligula's priorities and nothing good about being a regular person in ancient Rome. According to ancient sources, particularly the gossipy historian Suetonius, Incitatus resided in a marble stable with an ivory manger, purple blankets, and a collar studded with precious stones, because apparently regular horse accommodations were too pedestrian for an imperial equine. The horse allegedly had a staff of servants, drank wine from golden goblets, and ate oats mixed with gold flakes, which is the kind of diet that would make modern Instagram influencers weep with envy. We're talking about a horse living in accommodations nicer than most senators' homes, being treated with more dignity than actual human members of government. Caligula reportedly invited Incitatus to dinner parties as a guest, which must have made for absolutely fascinating conversation dynamics when you're trying to network with the emperor and there's a horse eating from fine china next to you. Ancient accounts claim the emperor would insist on silence during these meals so as not to disturb his equine companion, effectively meaning that Rome's political elite sat quietly watching a horse eat while their own futures hung in the balance. The absurdity reaches its peak with the famous claim that Caligula planned to make Incitatus a consul, one of Rome's highest political offices, traditionally reserved for the empire's most distinguished citizens. Whether this actually happened or was merely threatened remains historically debated, but the fact that it's even plausible tells you exactly how far off the rails this administration had gone in just a couple of years. Now, here's where we separate historical fact from ancient propaganda, because Roman historians had axes to grind, and they sharpened them on Caligula's reputation. The horse as senator story appears primarily in sources written decades after Caligula's death by authors who never met him and had every reason to portray him as insane. It justified his assassination and made subsequent emperors look reasonable by comparison. Some modern historians suggest the consul threat was actually a darkly humorous political statement. Caligula essentially telling the Senate they were so useless, so performatively incompetent, that a horse could do their job equally well. It's the ancient Roman equivalent of saying, I could replace you with a very simple shell script, except the shell script is a literal horse, and the stakes involve the entire Mediterranean world. Whether the consulship was genuine insanity, political satire, or deliberate humiliation of the Senate, the Incitatus story reveals something crucial about Caligula's reign: his complete contempt for traditional Roman institutions and the people who upheld them. After growing up watching these same institutions destroy his family through political machinations, murder, and exile, perhaps treating Rome's sacred political offices as a joke felt like poetic justice to him. The Senate that had enabled Tiberius's tyranny, that had stood by while his mother starved and his brothers died, now had to seriously consider whether they'd be working alongside livestock. If you want to delegitimize a political system, making its members ponder their equivalents to farm animals is definitely one approach, though perhaps not the most subtle one in the imperial playbook. The Incitatus affair wasn't happening in isolation. By 39 CE, Caligula's relationship with reality had become increasingly negotiable. He'd begun construction on a temple dedicated to himself, complete with a life-sized golden statue that was dressed daily in clothing matching whatever the emperor wore. Because if you're going to commit to narcissism, you might as well go full Renaissance painting. He reportedly appointed priests to his own cult and demanded sacrifices be made to him as a living god, which was pushing Roman religious boundaries past their breaking point. Previous emperors were deified after death as a political courtesy. Caligula decided to skip the dying part and enjoy worship while he could still appreciate it. This is the equivalent of writing your own eulogy, except you deliver it yourself and expect applause. His military adventures during this period were equally bizarre. In 39 CE, Caligula led troops to the Rhine, ostensibly to deal with Germanic tribes, but the campaign was more theatrical performance than military operation. He allegedly had soldiers collect seashells from a beach, calling them spoils of the ocean and plunder from Neptune, as trophies of his conquest over the sea god, which is definitely not standard Roman military protocol. Ancient sources describe him ordering his troops to attack the English Channel itself, stabbing at waves with their swords, which sounds like either a mental breakdown or the world's most elaborate joke that nobody else found funny. Modern historians debate whether this actually happened or was enemy propaganda, but the fact that it's believable based on his other behavior speaks volumes about his reputation. The Bridge of Baiae deserves special mention as peak Caligula excess. In 39 CE, he ordered the construction of a temporary floating bridge across the Bay of Baiae using boats lashed together, stretching approximately 2 miles, essentially commandeering every available vessel in the region and creating a massive traffic jam for maritime commerce. Once completed, Caligula reportedly spent 2 days riding back and forth across it wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate, allegedly borrowed from Alexander's tomb in Alexandria, hosting parties on the bridge, and generally treating the Mediterranean as his personal playground. The stunt cost an enormous amount of money, disrupted regional shipping, and served absolutely no strategic purpose whatsoever. It was conspicuous consumption meets engineering feat meets middle finger to anyone who suggested fiscal responsibility, all rolled into one spectacular waste of resources. Ancient sources claim the bridge building had a specific purpose, proving astrologer wrong. Supposedly, the astrologer Thrasyllus had told Tiberius that Caligula had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the Bay of Baiae. And Caligula, never one to let a metaphor slide, took it literally and made it happen. Whether this origin story is true or not, it perfectly encapsulates his governing philosophy. Spare no expense, proving a point nobody needed proven. Prioritize spectacle over substance. And if the Senate objects, remind them that you could always promote your horse to their ranks. It's the kind of pettiness that requires both unlimited resources and zero accountability. A combination that rarely produces good governance, but definitely produces memorable anecdotes. During these same months, Caligula's sisters became central to increasingly scandalous rumors that even Roman historians, who were not exactly prudish, found shocking. He had 3 sisters, Agrippina the Younger, Julia Drusilla, and Julia Livilla, and ancient sources claim his relationships with them crossed every possible boundary. Suetonius alleges incestuous relationships with all 3, though Drusilla was supposedly his favorite, treated almost as a wife despite both being married to other people. When Drusilla died in 38 CE, possibly from fever, Caligula's grief was reportedly so extreme that he declared her a goddess, made mourning her mandatory throughout the empire, and supposedly made it a capital offense to laugh, bathe, or dine with family during the mourning period, which must have made for a really depressing month across Rome. The remaining 2 sisters, Agrippina and Livilla, eventually got caught up in a conspiracy against Caligula in 39 CE, alongside his brother-in-law Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, who might have been Caligula's lover according to some sources. Ancient Rome was complicated that way. When the plot was discovered, Caligula had Lepidus executed and his sisters exiled, which was almost merciful by his standards, though he allegedly made Agrippina carry Lepidus's ashes back to Rome personally as punishment, because normal consequences weren't theatrical enough. The conspiracy marked a turning point where Caligula's paranoia shifted into overdrive. And if you thought he was difficult to work with before, he now saw potential assassins everywhere, which, to be fair, was increasingly accurate given how many people wanted him dead. His building projects during 39 and 40 CE reflected his deteriorating grip on both fiscal reality and practical necessity. Beyond his personal temple, he began extending the imperial palace to connect directly with the temple of Jupiter, because walking to worship like a commoner was beneath him, he needed a private skyway to the gods. He started construction on a new palace at Antium, planned elaborate renovations of existing structures, and generally spent money like someone who believed treasuries magically refilled themselves. Meanwhile, the actual business of governing, managing provinces, maintaining infrastructure, conducting diplomacy, took a backseat to increasingly elaborate demonstrations of imperial power. It's what happens when you give someone who's fundamentally uninterested in administration absolute control. The empire doesn't collapse immediately. It just slowly transforms into one person's expensive therapy session. The economic strain of Caligula's spending manifested in increasingly desperate revenue generation schemes that made his earlier tax innovations look reasonable. He allegedly instituted taxes on food, lawsuits, porters' earnings, and prostitutes' fees. Basically, if it moved or generated income, Caligula found a way to tax it. Core proceedings became fundraising opportunities where the emperor would convict wealthy citizens of treason, confiscate their estates, and occasionally force their families to thank him publicly for his mercy in not executing everyone. Inheritance became particularly dangerous. One ancient account claims Caligula invalidated wills that didn't name him as a beneficiary, which is definitely one way to supplement your income, though perhaps not the most ethical approach to estate planning. The Roman elite found themselves in an impossible position, too poor to be worth confiscating from, but not so poor that it looked like you were hiding assets. By 40 CE, Caligula had decided that his divine status needed international recognition, which led to one of history's more spectacular diplomatic disasters involving the Jewish population of the empire. The trouble started in Alexandria, Egypt, where tensions between the Greek and Jewish communities had been simmering for years like a pot nobody bothered watching until it boiled over spectacularly. The Greeks, eager to curry favor with an emperor who literally thought he was a god, decided to install statues of Caligula in Jewish synagogues, which violated fundamental Jewish religious law about graven images. This was roughly equivalent to serving bacon at a bar mitzvah and expecting everyone to be cool about it. Technically, you can do it, but you're deliberately starting a fight you know is coming. The Jewish community predictably refused, riots erupted, and Caligula, never one to let a theological disagreement slide, took the rejection personally, because apparently when you believe you're divine, religious objections feel like personal insults. He decided the solution was obvious: install a massive statue of himself as Jupiter in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, the holiest site in Judaism, thereby solving the recognition problem while simultaneously committing what would have been religious and cultural suicide for the entire region. The governor of Syria, Publius Petronius, received these orders and immediately recognized them for what they were: a catastrophically bad idea that would trigger revolts across the Eastern Empire. Petronius did what any sensible administrator does when given insane orders. He stalled, hoping the emperor would forget, die, or regain his senses, whichever came first. Jewish delegations traveled to Rome to plead their case, including the philosopher Philo of Alexandria, who left behind written accounts of meeting Caligula that read like fever dreams. According to Philo, Caligula received them while inspecting decorations in his gardens and villas, walking rapidly from room to room while the desperate delegates chased after him, trying to explain why desecrating their temple might be problematic. The emperor apparently interrupted their theological arguments to ask questions like whether Jews really didn't eat pork, expressing more interest in dietary restrictions than the potential rebellion he was about to trigger. Imagine trying to prevent a holy war while your audience is distracted by interior design choices and expressing genuine confusion about bacon. That was the level of engagement the Jewish delegates received from the Emperor of Rome. Meanwhile, Petronius in Syria was playing the longest game of bureaucratic delay in Roman administrative history, writing back to Caligula with updates about how the statue was definitely being made, just taking longer than expected due to artistic considerations, technical difficulties, and absolutely not made-up supply chain issues. He also warned that installing the statue would require military force and would likely result in Jews refusing to harvest crops, choosing martyrdom over compliance, which would destabilize Rome's grain supply. and nothing got Emperor's attention like threats to food security. Petronius was essentially banking on Caligula either forgetting about his divine recognition project or being assassinated before the statue was completed, which tells you everything about the confidence level of Roman administrators in their emperor's longevity by this point in his reign. The crisis dragged through much of 40 CE, with Petronius continuing his masterclass in strategic incompetence, while Jewish communities throughout the empire held their collective breath. Caligula, busy with other projects like his planned invasion of Britain, which never happened, and his ongoing feud with the Senate, apparently did lose interest occasionally before remembering and sending increasingly threatening letters demanding updates on his statue. At one point, he ordered Petronius to commit suicide for the delays, but the messenger carrying that particular death sentence was delayed by storms, and before Petronius received the execution order, news arrived that Caligula himself had been assassinated. This is the kind of timing that makes you believe in divine intervention, or at least really inconvenient weather patterns that save lives through sheer coincidence. Back in Rome, Caligula's daily behavior had become a masterclass in unpredictable tyranny that kept everyone perpetually off balance. He might greet you warmly at breakfast and order your execution by lunch, not because you'd done anything different between meals, but because his mood had shifted like Roman weather, sudden, inexplicable, and potentially fatal. Senators developed elaborate strategies for surviving interactions with the emperor. Never stand out too much, never fade into the background too completely. Laugh at his jokes, but not too enthusiastically, and definitely don't not laugh. It was like walking a tightrope while the rope was on fire, and someone kept shaking the platform for entertainment. The stress of serving under Caligula must have taken years off people's lives, assuming they kept their lives at all. His relationship with the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers responsible for protecting the emperor, had become increasingly strained despite his initial generosity toward them. Caligula trusted almost no one by 40 CE, which was actually good judgment given the number of people actively plotting his death, but it created a work environment where even the bodyguards weren't sure if they'd be rewarded or executed for doing their jobs correctly. He'd publicly humiliate Praetorian officers, question their loyalty during parades, and generally treat the people responsible for keeping him alive with the kind of contempt that makes those people reconsider their career choices. When your survival depends on men with swords, insulting them repeatedly is what management consultants might call counterintuitive leadership strategies, though they probably use more words and charge more money to say it. The famous boots that gave Caligula his nickname became a symbol of his complicated relationship with the military. He'd grown up as the legion's beloved mascot, but as emperor, his military adventures were theatrical disasters rather than actual campaigns. Beyond the seashell collecting incident, he apparently held mock battles, staged triumphs for victories that never happened, and generally played soldier without the inconvenient parts like actual combat or strategic planning. Real veterans who'd fought under his father Germanicus watched this performance with what must have been profound disappointment, seeing the son of Rome's greatest general treat warfare like a costume party. It's the equivalent of a CEO's kid getting hired into the family business and immediately trying to redesign everything based on a TED Talk they half-watched. Technically, they have the authority, but nobody respects the process. His spending continued at levels that would make modern deficit spending look quaint. Ancient sources claim he'd throw coins to crowd from palace roofs, not out of generosity, but to watch people scramble and fight for them. Entertainment that doubled his wealth distribution, though distribution might be generous for tossing money at desperate people and laughing. He'd bet enormous sums on chariot races, finance gladiatorial games so elaborate they'd run for days, and commission artwork so expensive that ancient historians mention the cost centuries later with disbelief. Every day was an opportunity to demonstrate that wealth meant nothing to him because he had unlimited access to it, at least until the Treasury started sending increasingly desperate reports that unlimited might be more limited than he thought. Food became another arena for demonstrating excess and contempt simultaneously. Banquets under Caligula were legendary for all the wrong reasons. Guests never knew if they were being honored or humiliated, sometimes both in the same evening. He'd serve incredibly expensive dishes and then mock guests for enjoying them, or serve worthless food on golden plates as a joke about their actual worth to him. Ancient accounts describe dinners where senators were seated according to his current opinion of them, with seating arrangements changing mid-meal as he reassessed their value, creating a musical chair scenario where standing up might mean promotion or execution. Dinner invitations from the emperor became the world's most stressful social obligation, like getting a meeting request from HR that just says, "Let's talk," with no additional context. The cultural damage of Caligula's reign extended beyond politics into Rome's artistic and intellectual life. He allegedly closed the academy and banned Homeric works because they celebrated Greek culture over Roman, though whether this actually happened or was historical exaggeration remains debated. He certainly interfered with theatrical performances, sometimes jumping on stage to perform himself, which must have made for awkward moments when the emperor's amateur hour interrupted professional productions. Ancient sources claim he was jealous of anyone receiving more applause than him, which created a chilling effect where artists had to carefully calibrate their success to be impressive, but not too impressive, popular, but not more popular than the guy who could have you killed for being too talented. His paranoia about potential rivals extended to absurd lengths by late 40 CE. He'd examine every statue and portrait for signs of conspiracy, question artists about their intentions, and generally see threat in everything from architecture to fashion choices. If someone looked too good, they were probably plotting. If they looked terrible, they were probably plotting, but worse at hiding it. There was no winning move in this game, except hoping to stay beneath notice, while also staying relevant enough not to seem suspicious through obscurity. It's the kind of logical paradox that makes everyone crazy eventually. The psychological toll of living under this system affected everyone from senators to slaves, creating an entire society operating under constant, unpredictable threat from the one person who was supposed to provide stability. The conspiracy that finally ended Caligula's reign had been brewing for months, involving a complicated web of senators, Praetorian guards, and palace insiders who'd finally had enough of living in an empire that functioned like a psychological thriller with no final act. At the center was Cassius Chaerea, a Praetorian tribune who became a particular target of Caligula's mockery despite being a decorated military veteran. The emperor apparently thought Chaerea's high-pitched voice was hilarious and would assign him deliberately humiliating passwords like Priapus or Venus, basically making dick jokes at the expense of a man trained to kill efficiently. Humiliating a soldier responsible for your personal safety seems like poor risk assessment, but Caligula had long since stopped calculating consequences, operating instead on pure impulse and the assumption of invincibility that comes from years of getting away with everything. Chaerea found willing co-conspirators among other Praetorian officers who'd watched their institution become the emperor's personal comedy troupe, rather than Rome's elite military force. Joining them were senators who understood that Caligula's behavior wasn't improving with age and were tired of wondering whether today would be the day their wealth got confiscated or their families got executed for imaginary crimes. The conspiracy even included some of Caligula's own freedmen and palace staff, people who worked closest to him and had front-row seats to his deteriorating mental state and increasingly violent whims. When your household staff starts plotting your murder, it's probably time for some serious self-reflection. Though self-reflection wasn't exactly Caligula's strongest skill even on his best days, which by 41 CE were increasingly rare. The plotters chose January 24th, 41 CE, during the Palatine Games, because apparently ancient conspirators understood that the best time to assassinate someone is when they're distracted by entertainment and surrounded by enough chaos that multiple stabbings might go unnoticed initially. Caligula was attending theatrical performances in a temporary covered walkway connecting the palace to the theater, basically a private corridor that was supposed to provide security but instead provided the perfect isolated location for murder. Ancient sources disagree on exact details, as they tend to do when describing events where most witnesses had strong incentives to lie afterwards. But the general consensus is that Chaerea and his co-conspirators cornered Caligula in this passage, away from the main crowd, but not entirely alone, which meant there would be witnesses but not enough security to intervene quickly. According to ancient historians, primarily Suetonius and Cassius Dio, writing decades later with access to conflicting accounts, Chaerea struck first, allegedly stabbing Caligula through the jaw, which is oddly specific and might have been symbolic given how much trouble that jaw had caused through insults, mockery, and declaring divinity. Other conspirators joined in, and within moments, the 20-year-old emperor who declared himself a living god was very definitively mortal, bleeding out in a palace corridor while theatrical performances continued nearby. The assassination took only minutes, but it had been building for nearly 4 years, fueled by every humiliation, every execution, every moment where Caligula chose cruelty over basic human decency. It's difficult to maintain absolute power when you've systematically given everyone reasons to want you dead and underestimated the very people responsible for keeping you alive. The conspirators didn't stop with Caligula. They also murdered his fourth wife, Caesonia, and their infant daughter Julia Drusilla, smashing the baby's head against a wall according to particularly gruesome accounts. This wasn't just political assassination. It was elimination of the entire imperial line to prevent any revenge or succession claims, which is Roman politics at its most brutally practical. Caesonia had reportedly been deeply devoted to Caligula despite his obvious problems, which suggests either genuine love, Stockholm Syndrome, or recognition that being married to the emperor meant your survival depended on his, making them a package deal even in death. The daughter's murder was pure insurance. Can't have surviving heirs claiming the throne later, even if that heir is literally an infant who poses zero immediate threat to anyone except possibly palace laundry staff. News of the assassination spread through Rome with the kind of speed that suggests many people have been waiting for exactly this announcement, already prepared with their reactions. The Praetorian Guard, suddenly without an emperor and facing uncertain futures, found Caligula's uncle Claudius literally hiding behind a curtain in the palace. Yes, really behind a curtain, like a child playing hide-and-seek who forgot to check if his feet were visible. Claudius had survived Caligula's reign precisely because everyone considered him a stammering, limping fool unworthy of notice, let alone assassination. The guard declared him emperor, possibly because he was the only adult male Julian family member still alive and in the palace, making him emperor by default through a combination of proximity and low expectations, which is definitely not how imperial succession was supposed to work, but accurately reflected how desperate and chaotic the situation had become. The Senate, upon hearing of Caligula's death, briefly entertained fantasies of restoring the Republic. That beautiful dream that had been dead for decades, but senators still brought up whenever emperor-related problems emerged, like your uncle who insists vinyl sounds better despite owning a smartphone. They debated for hours about returning to traditional Republican governance, conveniently forgetting that the Republic had collapsed precisely because it couldn't govern an empire this size, and that they were the same Senate that had enabled both Tiberius's tyranny and Caligula's madness through inaction and self-preservation. This is the equivalent of a company's board of directors responding to a CEO scandal by suggesting they eliminate the CEO position entirely and govern by committee, which sounds great in theory until you remember why CEOs exist in the first place and how well committee-led organizations handle crises. While the Senate debated political philosophy, the Praetorian Guard was making practical decisions with swords. They had Claudius. They wanted their promised bonuses for supporting a new emperor, and they weren't particularly interested in the Senate's Republican cosplay when cold hard cash was on the table. Claudius, for all his apparent disabilities, understood this dynamic immediately and promised enormous donatives to the guards, essentially buying the throne with money he didn't technically have yet, but would definitely have once they made him emperor. The Senate, faced with armed soldiers backing a different candidate and no military force of their own, quickly abandoned their Republican dreams and confirmed Claudius, proving once again that in Rome, political power grew from the pointy end of the gladius, not from rhetorical debates about constitutional theory. Caligula's body was cremated quickly without the elaborate funeral rites typically accorded to emperors, possibly because nobody wanted to spend time honoring him or risk public displays that might turn into celebrations rather than mourning. His ashes were reportedly given to his sisters, the same sisters he'd exiled, who returned from banishment to bury him in the mausoleum of Augustus, though with minimal ceremony and maximum speed. Ancient sources suggest his pyre was barely guarded, and that nobody seemed particularly concerned about showing respect to the man who demanded divine worship just weeks earlier. It's the kind of inglorious end that happens when you spend years ensuring nobody will miss you, building a legacy of fear and resentment rather than accomplishment or affection, treating governance like performance art instead of actual responsibility. The damnatio memoriae, official condemnation of memory, came swiftly, though not as comprehensively as for some later emperors. The Senate ordered Caligula's statues melted down, his name chiseled from inscriptions, and his acts officially nullified where practical, though by this point Rome had become quite efficient at memory holding problematic emperors, having had practice with earlier examples. Some images survived, either through bureaucratic oversight or because they depicted him with other, more popular family members like his father Germanicus, making selective editing complicated. Coins bearing his image continued circulating because you can't exactly recall currency without economic chaos, meaning Romans would be handling Caligula's face for decades, a daily reminder that you can't entirely erase someone who controlled the money supply. The historical record of Caligula's reign comes almost entirely from sources written after his death by authors with varying agendas and no love for the dead emperor, primarily Suetonius's The 12 Caesars and Cassius Dio's Roman History, both written decades later, drawing on earlier accounts now lost. This creates obvious reliability problems. How much of what we know about Caligula is accurate history versus propaganda designed to justify his assassination and make subsequent emperors look reasonable? Were some stories exaggerated by senators wanting to explain why they'd tolerated such behavior for nearly 4 years? Did some truly insane actions actually happen? Or were they malicious rumors that became accepted as fact through repetition? Modern historians argue endlessly about these questions, which is academia's way of saying, we honestly don't know, but we'll write papers about our uncertainty nonetheless. What's undeniable is that Caligula ruled for 3 years and 10 months, roughly 1,400 days, and managed to so thoroughly alienate every major power structure in Rome that multiple independent conspiracies were forming simultaneously by the time Chaerea succeeded. Whether he was genuinely mentally ill, performing calculated political theater, or simply a traumatized young man with unlimited power and zero accountability, the result was the same. An empire that functioned despite him rather than because of him, held together by bureaucratic momentum and administrators who'd learned to ignore their boss while appearing to follow orders. His reign proved that Rome's governmental systems were robust enough to survive spectacularly bad leadership, at least temporarily, which is simultaneously reassuring about institutional resilience and deeply concerning about how long dysfunction can persist before triggering systemic collapse. The immediate aftermath of Caligula's assassination revealed just how much damage one person with absolute power could inflict on an empire in less than 4 years, and how quickly people would pretend that damage never happened once the threat was removed. Claudius, the stammering uncle who'd survived by seeming harmless, immediately faced the challenge of governing an empire whose treasury was depleted, whose senate was traumatized and distrustful of imperial power, and whose provinces were still dealing with crises that Caligula had either created or ignored while busy declaring himself divine. The new emperor's first acts included canceling the Jerusalem temple statue project. Petronius's strategic incompetence had paid off spectacularly, and restoring some semblance of normal relations with the Senate, though normal was relative when the previous administration's idea of Senate relations involved threatening to appoint livestock to consulships. The financial situation Claudius inherited was spectacularly bad, with the treasury drained by Caligula's building projects, games, and general inability to understand that money, even imperial money, was finite. The Bridge of Baiae alone had cost enough to fund several military campaigns or feed provinces for months, but instead it had funded 2 days of Caligula riding back and forth across a bay wearing borrowed armor. Claudius faced the unglamorous work of actual administration, restoring fiscal responsibility, rebuilding relationships with provincial governors who've been operating with minimal imperial guidance, and convincing everyone that maybe this emperor wouldn't execute them for making eye contact wrong. It's the governmental equivalent of cleaning up after the world's worst party. Except the party lasted nearly 4 years, and the cleanup affects millions of people across 3 continents. The Jewish communities throughout the empire breathed collective sighs of relief that their holiest site wouldn't be desecrated, but the crisis had revealed dangerous fault lines in Roman religious tolerance that would resurface in later decades. Caligula's demand for worship had pushed against fundamental Jewish monotheism in ways that previous emperors had carefully avoided, recognizing that some conflicts aren't worth the administrative headache they create. The episode demonstrated that imperial cult worship, generally a harmless political ritual most subjects performed without thinking, could become a weapon when emperors took their own divinity seriously rather than treating it as the polite fiction it was supposed to be. Future emperors would remember this lesson with varying degrees of success, though none would quite match Caligula's spectacular combination of narcissism and theological insensitivity. Caligula's building projects remained as physical reminders of his reign, though many were abandoned, incomplete, or repurposed by later emperors who didn't share his aesthetic vision or unlimited spending tolerance. His temple to himself was never finished, which seems appropriately ironic. The living god couldn't complete his own house of worship before mortality caught up with him. Some structures were torn down entirely, their materials recycled for more practical purposes, turning Caligula's monuments to megalomania into apartment buildings or aqueducts. It's the architectural equivalent of turning someone's vanity project into something actually useful, which is satisfying in a way that transcends historical periods. Rome literally built over his legacy, which is perhaps the most Roman response possible to a problematic emperor. Acknowledge he existed, learn what we can, then pave over the embarrassing parts and move forward. The horse Incitatus disappears from historical record after Caligula's death, which is somehow the saddest footnote in this entire story. A horse who'd lived in marble luxury, drunk from golden goblets, and nearly become a consul reduced to complete obscurity once his patron was murdered. We don't know if Incitatus was demoted to regular horse status, sold off, or retired to a normal stable somewhere. But the fact that nobody bothered recording his fate suggests that without Caligula's protection, he was just another horse again. There's something deeply Roman about that. The symbols of the previous regime disappear quickly when the regime changes, whether those symbols are statues, building projects, or unusually pampered livestock. The horse who'd been one meeting away from political office probably ended his days pulling carts or racing in games, which is a remarkable fall from grace, even for an animal who presumably never understood the significance of any of it. Modern historians continue debating Caligula's mental state with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for arguing about sports statistics, which makes sense since we're essentially trying to diagnose someone who died 2,000 years ago using sources written by people who hated him. Some argue he had epilepsy, potentially triggered or worsened by the illness in his 6th month of reign, which could explain erratic behavior if seizures affected his cognition. Others suggest encephalitis from that same illness, which can cause personality changes, impulsivity, and reality testing problems. Basically, the entire Caligula symptom list. There's speculation about bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, or some other condition that would manifest as grandiosity, paranoia, and impulse control problems. The frustrating reality is that we'll never know for certain, and maybe it doesn't matter as much as we think. Plenty of mentally ill people don't bankrupt empires and threaten to make horses senators, which suggests that absolute power might have been the critical variable here, rather than any specific diagnosis. The alternative interpretation, that Caligula was performing calculated political theater designed to humiliate the Senate and break Roman traditions he viewed as responsible for his family's suffering, makes him more intentional, but not necessarily better. If the horse consul threat was satire, it was satire with body counts, where the joke involved real executions and genuine terror. If his divine pretensions were mockery of imperial cult practices, He committed to the bit hard enough that thousands of Jews nearly died over it. Political performance art stops being art when people die because of it, at which point it's just tyranny with extra steps and a more sophisticated vocabulary. Either interpretation, mad emperor or satirical tyrant, ends with the same corpse count and treasury depletion, which suggests that maybe motivation matters less than outcomes when evaluating leaders with absolute power. The speed with which Rome moved on from Caligula is remarkable, a collective decision to treat his reign as an unfortunate aberration rather than a systemic failure of imperial governance. This is understandable from a psychological perspective. Acknowledging that your political system had just given absolute power to someone spectacularly unfit for it raises uncomfortable questions about whether it might happen again. Better to classify Caligula as uniquely crazy, an outlier who couldn't have been predicted or prevented, than to examine how the Senate's cowardice, the Praetorian Guard's mercenary loyalty, and Rome's lack of any meaningful checks on imperial power had enabled every single one of his actions. It's easier to blame individual pathology than systemic dysfunction, which is why empires throughout history keep making the same mistakes with different personnel. The lessons Rome should have learned but largely didn't include: maybe concentrate less power in one person's hands. Perhaps create some mechanism for removing leaders who've clearly lost touch with reality, and definitely don't let your elite military unit decide imperial succession based on who promises them the biggest cash bonus. Instead, Rome continued with the Principate system largely unchanged, trusting that future emperors would be more like Augustus and less like Caligula, which worked until it didn't, repeatedly, across the next several centuries. They did establish informal precedents about behaviors that would trigger assassination. Declaring yourself a living god too enthusiastically would get you killed. Neglecting the military completely was suicide, and alienating literally everyone simultaneously was poor survival strategy. These weren't official rules so much as observed patterns, the kind of institutional knowledge that gets passed down as previous guy tried that and got stabbed, so maybe don't. Caligula's sisters, Agrippina and Livilla, the survivors, returned from exile and resumed their positions in Roman high society, which tells you something about how political rehabilitation worked in ancient Rome. Agrippina, the younger particularly, would become significant later, eventually becoming mother to Emperor Nero and demonstrating that the family's talent for political survival and spectacular dysfunction was apparently genetic or at least taught through example. She learned from watching both Tiberius and her brother that power required careful manipulation, strategic marriages, and willingness to eliminate rivals. Lessons she'd apply with varying success throughout her life. The fact that Caligula's sister would raise another emperor who'd also end up assassinated after a reign of increasing madness suggests either terrible luck or that maybe Rome's imperial system had some fundamental problems that transcended individual personalities. The Senate's attempted restoration of the Republic, that brief moment where they debated returning to traditional governance before the Praetorian Guard reminded them who actually held power, became a historical footnote that scholars cite when discussing Rome's political delusions. By 41 CE, the Republic had been dead for decades, killed by civil wars, ambitious generals, and its own inability to govern an empire stretching from Britain to Egypt. But senators kept fantasizing about its return the way people fantasize about past relationships, remembering the good parts while conveniently forgetting all the corruption, violence, and structural problems that had made it unsustainable in the first place. Every bad emperor triggered these Republican revival fantasies, and every time, reality, usually in the form of soldiers with swords, reminded them that nostalgia wasn't a viable political platform when you needed to control millions of people across vast distances. The historical irony of Caligula's nickname, Little Boots, the cute name soldiers gave a child they adored, persisting as how we remember him 2 millennia later adds a final absurd note to his story. He's forever branded with a diminutive, affectionate term completely at odds with the terror and chaos of his actual reign, as if the universe decided that someone who tried so hard to be taken seriously as a god deserved to be remembered as baby shoes. His actual name, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, was impressive enough for any resume, connecting him to Rome's most illustrious families. But history said, nah, we're calling you Little Boots forever, which is perhaps the most fitting punishment for someone who demanded absolute reverence. Eternal slight, ridiculousness baked into your historical identity. Impossible to separate from accounts of your actions, no matter how seriously those actions should be taken. The psychological profile of Caligula that emerges from ancient sources reads like a case study in what happens when childhood trauma meets unlimited power meets zero accountability. Though we should remember these sources were written by people who needed to justify why they'd tolerated him for nearly 4 years before finally stabbing him. His early life was objectively horrifying by any standard. Watching his beloved father die mysteriously, seeing his mother exiled and starved, his brothers eliminated one by one, then spending his formative teenage years living with the paranoid emperor who'd orchestrated these tragedies, pretending everything was fine while planning survival strategies. Most people emerging from that background would need serious therapy. Caligula got an empire instead, which is approximately the worst possible treatment plan for unresolved trauma, combined with trust issues and a comprehensive education in how tyranny actually worked from the inside. The transformation from popular young emperor to apparent madman wasn't instantaneous, which some historians argue suggests his later behavior was learned rather than inevitable. He'd spent years observing Tiberius exercise power through fear and capricious cruelty, and perhaps concluded this was simply how emperors operated once they stopped pretending to care about appearances. The illness 6 months into his reign might have been a catalyst, either through brain damage or through the psychological realization of his own mortality despite his youth and power. Triggering an existential crisis, he resolved by declaring himself immortal and divine. Or maybe the illness was coincidental, and he'd simply spent 6 months testing boundaries, discovering that nobody would stop him from doing literally anything, and deciding to see exactly how far anything could stretch before someone intervened with sharp objects. His relationship with his family, both the dead and the living, shaped his reign in ways that ancient sources hint at but never fully explore, probably because Roman historians weren't particularly interested in psychological motivation beyond he was crazy and/or evil. Deifying his dead sister Drusilla, while allegedly having incestuous relationships with his other sisters, suggests someone trying to recreate family connections destroyed by political violence, except recreating them in deeply dysfunctional ways because healthy relationship modeling wasn't exactly abundant in his childhood. The fact that those surviving sisters eventually conspired against him adds another layer of tragedy. Even the family bonds he tried to maintain, however inappropriately, couldn't survive the paranoia and violence that defined his reign. You can't build trust when you've learned from experience that everyone close to you either dies or betrays you. And when you have the power to execute people preemptively, that lesson becomes self-fulfilling prophecy. The divine status claims that seem most insane to modern readers might have made a certain twisted sense within Caligula's worldview, especially if we interpret them as coping mechanisms rather than genuine delusions. If you've watched the normal rules of society fail to protect anyone you loved, if you've seen that human institutions like the Senate enabled your family's destruction, perhaps elevating yourself above humanity entirely seems like the only logical way to ensure safety. Gods can't be touched by mortal conspiracies, at least in theory. The conversations with the moon and Jupiter could have been genuine hallucinations, or they could have been theatrical performances designed to unsettle observers and maintain unpredictability. Or they could have been how a profoundly isolated person processed decisions when trusting human advisors have been trained out of him through repeated betrayals. We're essentially trying to reconstruct the inner life of someone who had every incentive to hide his actual thoughts and whose behavior we only know through hostile witnesses. The cruelty that characterized his reign might have started as strategic intimidation. Keep everyone off balance and afraid, and they can't organize against you, a lesson Tiberius had taught thoroughly, but appears to have evolved into something more pathological, or at least more personal. The humiliation of senators wasn't just political calculation. Ancient sources suggest he genuinely enjoyed their discomfort, which indicates either sadistic personality traits or deep resentment finding outlets in petty tyranny. When you've been powerless and watched powerful people fail to protect those you loved, gaining power over those same people or their colleagues must have provided satisfaction beyond strategic value. Every senator he humiliated was payback for the Senate that had enabled his family's destruction. Every execution was revenge for losses he'd had no power to prevent as a child and teenager. This doesn't excuse the behavior, but it provides context beyond random madness, suggesting instead a very specific madness with clear historical roots. The spending patterns that bankrupted Rome weren't entirely irrational if we understand them as demonstrations of power and permanence. Building monuments and hosting games were how Roman leaders traditionally secured their legacy and popular support. Caligula just did it without any sense of proportion or fiscal reality, as if trying to compress an entire lengthy reign's worth of achievement into a few short years, possibly because some part of him understood he wouldn't last long. The Bridge of Baiae makes more sense as a legacy project when you consider he was creating something literally unprecedented, ensuring he'd be remembered for engineering achievement even if everything else fell apart. That it cost a fortune and served no purpose was perhaps the point. He could afford to waste resources on whims, which was itself a demonstration of power that traditional military victories would have communicated for earlier emperors who had patience and strategic sense. His treatment of Incitatus, the horse who nearly became consul, reveals perhaps the clearest window into his mindset, assuming the story is true or even partially true rather than complete senatorial fabrication. If you genuinely believe the Senate is worthless, that its members are performative politicians whose deliberations mean nothing compared to imperial will, then treating a horse as their equivalent is an insanity. It's editorial commentary. The horse becomes a living political cartoon, a daily reminder that senatorial dignity is whatever the emperor says it is, that their ancient traditions and prestigious positions mean only what he allows them to mean. It's contempt expressed through absurdist theater, turning the government into a performance piece where the punchline is, you're all interchangeable with livestock and you can't do anything about it. As psychological warfare goes, it's actually quite sophisticated, even if the sophistication was buried under layers of apparent madness. The question of whether Caligula could have been stopped earlier, whether there were intervention points where different choices might have produced different outcomes, haunts the historical record like a ghost of counterfactual possibility. If the Senate had stood up to him during the first executions, if the Praetorian Guard had refused orders earlier, if advisors had managed to constrain him somehow, would the reign have stabilized, or would he have simply killed dissenters faster? Roman political culture had spent decades eroding checks on imperial power, removing any institutional mechanisms that might have constrained an emperor determined to ignore tradition, making Caligula simultaneously inevitable and unique. The system had created vulnerability to exactly this kind of leadership, but required this specific combination of trauma, intelligence, cruelty, and circumstance to actually manifest it. The medical speculation about his illness in the 6th month, the potential turning point where everything changed, continues because it offers a comforting narrative. He was fine, got sick, brain damage happened, tragedy ensued, implying that without that illness, Rome might have had a good emperor. But this narrative ignores that the person who existed before the illness was someone who'd spent years concealing his true thoughts from Tiberius, performing whatever role kept him alive, suggesting considerable capacity for deception and manipulation before any brain damage occurred. Maybe the illness didn't create a monster. Maybe it just removed whatever inhibitions and strategic patience had been restraining someone whose formative experiences had already shaped him in deeply problematic ways. The difference matters for historical analysis, but changes nothing about the outcome. Thousands dead, treasury emptied, institutions damaged, and an empire that learned surprisingly little from the experience. The speed of his assassination after less than 4 years demonstrates both how intolerable he'd become and how difficult removing an emperor actually was, even when everyone agreed it was necessary. Multiple conspiracies forming independently suggests many people had the same idea, killing Caligula. But implementation required coordination, courage, and opportunity that took months to align. The Praetorian Guard's involvement was essential. No conspiracy could succeed without them, which meant convincing soldiers sworn to protect the emperor that killing him was preferable to continuing their employment, a significant threshold to cross. Cheria's personal motivation, humiliation over passwords and jokes, seems almost trivial compared to the state-level justifications about tyranny and fiscal responsibility. But personal grievances drive historical events as surely as political philosophy. And sometimes the joke that goes too far is what finally pushes someone to act when abstract principle wouldn't. The lack of any succession plan beyond kill the current emperor and figure it out afterwards characterized not just Caligula's assassination, but Roman imperial succession generally. A system held together by improvisation, military force, and occasional luck rather than any coherent constitutional framework. Finding Claudius behind a curtain and declaring him emperor because he was available and male and vaguely related was embarrassing but functional, which summarized Roman political pragmatism perfectly. Whatever works is legitimate. Legitimacy is whatever we can enforce with swords, and we'll write the theoretical justifications later once everyone stopped bleeding. This system would produce some excellent emperors, some terrible ones, and mostly mediocre ones, just like any other succession system, but with considerably more murder and military intervention in the process, which Romans apparently found acceptable because the alternatives, civil war or republican restoration, were worse. The counterintuitive legacy of Caligula is that his reign's very brevity and catastrophic nature might have strengthened the imperial system by providing a clear example of what not to do, creating informal boundaries through negative example that no written constitution could establish. Future emperors knew from Caligula's fate that you could push many boundaries, but pushing all of them simultaneously while alienating everyone who could protect you is suicide. The system survived him specifically because he failed so spectacularly and quickly that long-term damage was limited. He didn't have time to fundamentally restructure institutions, only to abuse existing ones. A competent tyrant might have been far more dangerous, gradually eroding republican traditions while maintaining enough support to die naturally, establishing precedents that normalized authoritarianism. Instead, Caligula's flame-out provided Rome with a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power, while paradoxically not actually checking that power, just encouraging future emperors to exercise it more carefully. The cultural afterlife of Caligula, how he's been remembered, reimagined, and recycled through 2,000 years of history, literature, and eventually film, tells us as much about successive generations' fears about power as it does about the actual Roman emperor who may or may not have done half the things attributed to him. Medieval Christian writers loved using Caligula as an example of pagan decadence and divine punishment, conveniently ignoring that their own religious and political leaders weren't exactly models of restraint when given similar power. Renaissance historians rediscovered the classical sources and found in Caligula a perfect case study for debates about tyranny, madness, and whether absolute monarchy was ever justifiable. He became a rhetorical weapon in political arguments, with each side interpreting his reign to support their preferred governmental theories, while the actual historical Caligula disappeared further beneath layers of interpretation and agenda. The Enlightenment brought new psychological frameworks for understanding Caligula, with philosophers and early psychologists attempting to diagnose him retroactively using emerging theories about mental illness, brain function, and the relationship between power and personality. Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire presented Caligula as evidence of systematic imperial corruption, part of Rome's inevitable decay rather than an isolated incident, which fit Gibbon's thesis about Christianity's role in Rome's fall, but required downplaying how quickly Rome recovered from Caligula and continued functioning for centuries. Every generation found in Caligula's story whatever they needed to find: evidence of divine judgment, proof that monarchies inevitably corrupt, warnings about unchecked executive power, or just entertaining scandalous history that let them feel morally superior to ancient Romans while enjoying the salacious details. The 20th century gave us perhaps the most influential Caligula interpretation through popular media, particularly the notorious 1979 film Caligula, which combined historical drama with explicit content in ways that ancient historians definitely didn't intend when recording Senate proceedings. The film, produced by Penthouse magazine's founder and starring legitimate actors who reportedly didn't know what they were signing up for, became simultaneously a historical epic, an exploitation film, and a cultural touchstone that defined Caligula for generations who'd never read Suetonius. Whether this representation was historically accurate mattered less than its cultural impact. Caligula became shorthand for sexual excess, violent insanity, and absolute power's corrupting influence, a historical figure who existed more as archetype than actual person in popular consciousness, reduced to his most sensational alleged behaviors and stripped of historical context. Modern historical documentaries and books have attempted to rehabilitate Caligula's reputation, or at least complicate it, by examining the sources more critically and acknowledging that much of what we know comes from hostile witnesses with political motivations. These revisionist interpretations suggest he might have been a reformer whose attempts to consolidate power and break senatorial privilege were portrayed as madness by the aristocrats he threatened, or that he was engaging in calculated political theater misunderstood by contemporary observers and later historians. Some scholars argue the horse consul story was either entirely fabricated or a joke taken seriously, that the divine claims were standard imperial cult practices exaggerated for propaganda purposes, and that the sexual scandals were routine political slander applied to enemies of the state. This rehabilitation effort faces the challenge of 2 millennia of reputation as history's favorite crazy emperor, which is difficult to overcome even with careful source analysis and academic rigor. The comparison between Caligula and modern leaders has become a rhetorical staple, invoked whenever politicians exhibit behavior that seems irrational, cruel, or self-aggrandizing. Everyone from actual tyrants to democratically elected officials who simply offend critics gets compared to Caligula at some point, usually with minimal understanding of the actual historical circumstances. This casual deployment of Caligula as political insult has degraded the comparison's meaning. When everyone you disagree with is compared to Rome's mad emperor, the comparison loses analytical value and becomes just another way to say bad leader I don't like. The real Caligula, whatever his actual characteristics, has been transformed into a symbol that carries more rhetorical weight than historical specificity, a convenient shorthand for tyranny that requires no nuanced understanding to deploy in arguments. The horse story specifically has achieved independent cultural life, referenced in context far removed from Roman history. Business articles about bad management cite it. Political commentators use it as shorthand for incompetent appointments, and it appears in comedy routines and casual conversation whenever someone wants to suggest that qualifications don't matter anymore for important positions. The fact that we're not entirely sure it actually happened doesn't diminish its cultural utility. The story has become true in the way that perfect anecdotes become true regardless of historical verification, because it captures something essential about power, contempt, and absurdity that resonates across centuries. Incitatus has achieved immortality that the actual horse certainly never experienced during its presumably normal-length equine lifetime, becoming more famous than most Roman senators whose actual accomplishments are documented. The psychological interpretations of Caligula have evolved with psychiatric understanding, with each generation's mental health frameworks applied retroactively to behaviors described in ancient texts written by people with no concept of psychology as a medical discipline. 19th century alienists diagnosed him with moral insanity. Early 20th century Freudians found him a perfect case study for psychosexual disorders. Mid-century psychiatrists suggested schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, and contemporary neurologists speculate about temporal lobe, epilepsy, or encephalitis-induced personality changes. Each diagnosis reflects the diagnosing era's preoccupations and available categories more than definitive evidence about Caligula's actual mental state, demonstrating how we project our current understanding onto historical figures whose inner experiences remain fundamentally inaccessible across 2 millennia of cultural, linguistic, and conceptual distance. The question of whether Caligula was evil, mad, or both, or whether those categories even apply meaningfully to someone in his circumstances, remains philosophically interesting even if historically unanswerable. If childhood trauma and institutional pressures shaped his behavior, does that diminish moral responsibility for actions that included execution, theft, and systematic terror? If mental illness influenced his decisions, where's the line between explaining behavior and excusing it, especially when the behavior affects millions of people and you have the power to seek treatment or abdicate, but choose neither? These questions don't have clean answers, which makes Caligula enduringly interesting beyond just the entertaining anecdotes about horses and bridge building. He represents fundamental puzzles about agency, responsibility, and power that remain relevant regardless of whether specific ancient accounts are accurate. The educational value of Caligula's story extends beyond its entertainment value, though the entertainment value certainly helps maintain interest over 2 millennia. He demonstrates how fragile political systems become when they concentrate power without building enforcement mechanisms for constraining that power, showing that institutional stability depends on norms, mutual restraint, and shared commitment to principles rather than just formal rules. He illustrates how trauma and psychology intersect with politics, how personal damage can scale to state-level consequences when the damaged person controls the state. He provides evidence that, yes, individuals still matter in history, even within powerful institutions. One person really can cause tremendous damage if circumstances align, contradicting deterministic historical theories that minimize individual agency in favor of broad social forces and economic conditions. The comparative analysis between Caligula and other historical tyrants, Nero, Commodus, various medieval kings, 20th century dictators, reveals patterns in how absolute power affects psychology and how societies respond to or enable destructive leadership. The similarities are striking. Paranoia increasing over time, boundary pushing that escalates when no consequences emerge, growing disconnect from reality as surrounding people become afraid to contradict, financial irresponsibility divorced from consequences, and eventual violent removal when the dysfunction becomes intolerable. The differences are equally instructive. Caligula lacked the institutional mechanisms that let modern dictators maintain power through bureaucratic terror. He didn't have ideological movements providing willing executioners and true believers, and his reign's brevity prevented the generational trauma that longer tyrannies produce. He was, in many ways, limited by his era's technology of oppression, able to cause tremendous damage but not systematize it effectively. The moral lessons drawn from Caligula's reign vary wildly, depending on political perspective. Conservatives cite him as evidence that traditional restraints on power must be maintained. Liberals use him to argue for stronger institutional checks on executive authority. Libertarians point to him as proof that concentrated government power inevitably corrupts. And monarchists argue he demonstrates why succession systems matter more than governmental forms. Everyone finds their preferred moral in his story, which suggests the story itself is sufficiently complex and ambiguous to support multiple interpretations, or alternatively, that people are really good at finding evidence for conclusions they've already reached. The actual lesson, if there is one, might simply be that giving anyone unlimited power is dangerous, that institutional design matters, and that sometimes the worst outcomes require multiple system failures happening simultaneously, but that's less satisfying than more specific political conclusions. The historiographical debate about Caligula, whether he was genuinely insane, politically calculated, or somewhere between, reflects broader arguments about how we write history and interpret sources that come from biased observers. Do we trust ancient historians who had access to witnesses but also had political agendas? Do we privilege archaeological evidence that can't be spun, but also can't tell us about motivations and mental states? Do we apply modern analytical frameworks, knowing they're anachronistic, but useful, Or do we try to understand him entirely within Roman cultural context at the risk of making him incomprehensible to modern readers? These methodological questions don't have definitive answers, which means Caligula scholarship will continue indefinitely, each generation reinterpreting based on new evidence, new analytical tools, and new present-day concerns that make certain historical questions seem suddenly urgent or relevant. The enduring fascination with Caligula ultimately stems from how his story combines elements that reliably capture human interest: power, sex, violence, madness, conspiracy, and spectacular failure, all wrapped in the exotic setting of ancient Rome and documented in sources that mix reliable reporting with obvious gossip. He provides entertainment and education simultaneously, letting us feel intellectually engaged while enjoying scandalous stories, offering moral lessons while indulging fascination with transgression. 2,000 years after his death, people still debate what happened in those corridors of power, what he was thinking, whether he could have been stopped, and what it all means for understanding leadership, psychology, and political systems. That's a remarkable legacy for someone who ruled for less than 4 years and spent much of that time apparently having conversations with the moon and planning his horse's political career, though whether he'd appreciate being remembered this way is another question entirely. The infrastructure Caligula left behind, both physical and institutional, tells a story about priorities that had nothing to do with Rome's actual needs and everything to do with personal aggrandizement masquerading as public works. His building projects focused on spectacle rather than utility. Temples to himself, palace extensions that served no purpose except demonstrating he could connect buildings just because he felt like it, and that ridiculous bridge across the Bay of Baiae that existed for 2 days of partying before being dismantled. Compare this to earlier emperors like Augustus, who'd rebuilt Rome's water supply, or later ones like Claudius, who'd construct functional harbors and aqueducts. Caligula's construction legacy was essentially architectural narcissism, buildings and structures designed to say, "Look at me," rather than "Look at what Rome can accomplish for its citizens." The treasury he depleted could have funded decades of road maintenance, military equipment, or grain subsidies, but instead it funded golden horse goblets and personal temples. The administrative chaos he created rippled through the empire in ways that weren't immediately obvious, but compounded over time, as competent administrators were executed or fled, replaced by loyalists selected for sycophancy rather than skill. Provincial governance suffered when governors spent more energy trying to interpret and survive imperial whims than actually governing their territories. If you're constantly worried about whether your latest report will be interpreted as treason, you're not focused on tax collection, infrastructure maintenance, or dispute resolution. The institutional knowledge that makes bureaucracies function got disrupted when experienced officials were randomly executed and their positions filled by whoever happened to be nearby and not currently under suspicion. Claudius spent years rebuilding administrative capacity that Caligula had destroyed through casual violence and paranoid purges, demonstrating that even empires with robust systems can be severely damaged by sufficiently incompetent leadership at the top. The military implications of Caligula's reign were potentially catastrophic, though Rome got lucky that no major external threats materialized during his nearly 4 years of theatrical rather than strategic military leadership. His campaign against the Germanic tribes and the sea itself became jokes that undermined Roman military prestige. When your enemies hear that your emperor ordered soldiers to collect seashells as victory spoils, it doesn't exactly inspire fear and respect. The legion's morale suffered when they realized their commander-in-chief was performing elaborate theater rather than conducting actual warfare, and discipline weakened when imperial attention focused on staging fake triumphs rather than maintaining combat readiness. That Rome's borders remained secure during this period owes more to institutional momentum, competent field commanders who ignored imperial directives, and enemy distraction than to any strategic planning from the top, proving that sometimes the best thing a bad leader can do is be so distracted by pet projects that they forget to interfere with actual operations. The economic damage Caligula inflicted through his taxation schemes and property confiscations created ripple effects throughout Roman commerce that lasted beyond his short reign. When wealthy citizens could have their estates confiscated on fabricated treason charges, investment became dangerous. Why build a successful business or accumulate visible wealth if it just makes you a target? When inheritance could be arbitrarily redirected to the emperor, long-term financial planning became pointless, undermining the generational wealth accumulation that funded Roman economic growth. The random nature of confiscations was almost worse than systematic taxation because it created unpredictability. Business people can work around known costs, but random asset seizure makes rational economic planning impossible. Claudius had to spend considerable effort restoring confidence in property rights and financial security, essentially promising, "No, really, we won't just steal your stuff anymore," which is not the foundation you want for economic policy. The social fabric damage, the erosion of trust between different classes and groups, might have been Caligula's most lasting negative legacy, even if it's hardest to quantify in historical sources focused on political and military events. Senators learned they couldn't trust the emperor or each other, creating paranoia that persisted into subsequent reigns. The Praetorian Guard discovered they could make and unmake emperors through violence, a lesson they'd apply repeatedly throughout subsequent centuries, turning imperial succession into an occasionally literal auction where the throne went to whoever promised the biggest bonuses. Common Romans learned that imperial attention was dangerous, that being noticed by the emperor rarely ended well, encouraging a culture of keeping your head down and avoiding distinction. Exactly the opposite of the civic engagement that had theoretically characterized Republican Rome and that emperors claimed to want to preserve even if they actually preferred compliant subjects. The religious implications of Caligula's self-deification attempt were complicated and far-reaching, pushing boundaries that later emperors would navigate more carefully. Roman religion had always been flexible and political, easily incorporating new gods and practices, but Caligula's demand for worship while alive and his aggressive enforcement of cross lines that made people uncomfortable even in a polytheistic system accustomed to divine emperors after death. His conflict with Jewish communities over temple statues established a precedent for religious conflict that would escalate in later decades, contributing to tensions that eventually exploded in the Jewish-Roman Wars. Future emperors learned from Caligula that demanding too much religious recognition too quickly could create serious problems, though some, like Domitian and later Diocletian, apparently forgot this lesson and had to relearn it through their own conflicts with Christians and other groups who refused to participate in imperial cult worship. The cultural production during Caligula's reign suffered from his personal interference and censorship of works that didn't flatter him adequately or that celebrated things he felt jealous about. Artists, writers, and performers learned to self-censor, avoiding topics or styles that might offend imperial sensibilities, which stifle creativity and innovation in ways that are hard to track historically but undoubtedly occurred. When the emperor might attend your theatrical performance and jump on stage to take over if you're too successful, or ban your work entirely if it doesn't praise him sufficiently, you stop taking creative risks and start producing safe, boring content designed not to offend rather than to inspire or challenge. The chilling effect on Roman cultural life during these years probably set back artistic development, though measuring what wasn't created because of censorship is inherently difficult. We can only note that Roman literature and art from this period is less remarkable than from before and after. The personal relationships Caligula destroyed, families torn apart by executions, friendships ended by suspicion and forced betrayals, marriages dissolved when one partner was accused of conspiracy, left emotional scars throughout Rome's upper classes that never fully healed. Children grew up without fathers executed for imaginary crimes. Wives lost husbands to imperial paranoia. Siblings learned to distrust each other when informing on family members could mean survival. This generational trauma doesn't appear much in ancient sources focused on political events and military campaigns, but it shaped how survivors approach relationships, power, and risk for the rest of their lives. The Romans who lived through Caligula's reign and survived carried psychological damage that influenced how they behaved under subsequent emperors, probably making them more cautious, more cynical, and less willing to speak truth to power even when that power was exercised more benignly. The precedents Caligula set, even negative ones, shaped future imperial behavior by establishing boundaries through their violation. Future emperors knew they could probably get away with certain corruptions and abuses, but also knew that going too far too fast in too many directions simultaneously would get them killed. He'd essentially mapped the outer limits of imperial power through transgression, showing where the breaking points were, how much the Senate would tolerate, what would trigger Praetorian intervention, and which behaviors would alienate everyone simultaneously. This was useful information for subsequent emperors, though the fact that they learned these lessons through watching someone get assassinated rather than through institutional design represents a fundamentally dysfunctional approach to governance. Rome was basically learning constitutional limits through trial and error, except the errors involved massive human suffering and the trials often ended in murder. The counterfactual speculation about what would have happened if Caligula had survived longer, if the conspiracies had failed or been delayed, is inherently unanswerable but interesting. Would he have eventually exhausted Roman patience completely, triggering civil war rather than just assassination? Would the Senate have found some mechanism to constrain him, or would he have eliminated the Senate entirely as a meaningful institution? Could he have stabilized somehow? The paranoia and excess moderating with age and experience, or was the trajectory toward increasing dysfunction inevitable? The brief duration of his reign leaves these questions open, but the pattern suggests that without external constraints or internal change, emperors like Caligula tend toward escalation rather than moderation. Power that's unchecked and uncheckable rarely constrains itself voluntarily. The historical what-ifs extend to the question of whether different initial responses might have changed outcomes. If the Senate had resisted his first overreaches, if advisors had successfully moderated his impulses, if the illness in his 6th month had killed rather than altered him, if his sisters hadn't conspired against him, thereby deepening his paranoia. But these counterfactuals assume individual moments of intervention could have redirected someone whose fundamental worldview had been shaped by childhood trauma and education in Tiberian tyranny. Caligula wasn't a normal person who happened into abnormal behavior. He was someone whose formative experiences had prepared him specifically for the role he ended up playing, even if that preparation was entirely dysfunctional. Changing individual incidents probably wouldn't have changed the overall trajectory without somehow changing the entire context that created him. The modern parallels people draw between Caligula and contemporary leaders, whether justified or overblown, reveal more about current anxieties than historical accuracy, but the pattern matching isn't entirely unreasonable. When modern leaders display narcissism, demand personal loyalty over institutional loyalty, attack checks on their power, spend public resources on personal aggrandizement, or govern through unpredictable impulse rather than consistent policy, the comparison to Rome's most famously dysfunctional emperor suggests itself even if the specifics don't match. The real lesson isn't this specific modern leader is exactly like Caligula, but rather these patterns of behavior have appeared throughout history in leaders with insufficient constraints on their power, and they rarely end well. Caligula serves as historical shorthand for a recognizable type of leadership dysfunction, which is why his name appears in contemporary political discourse with such frequency despite most people knowing only surface-level details about his actual reign. The comparison between Caligula's Rome and today's political landscape reveals both how much has changed in 2,000 years and how disturbingly little has changed about fundamental human nature when power enters the equation. Modern democracies theoretically learned from Rome's imperial disasters, building systems with separation of powers, term limits, checks and balances, and legal mechanisms for removing leaders who've clearly lost the plot. All the institutional safeguards that Rome conspicuously lacked and paid for repeatedly. Yet we still see leaders who treat national treasuries like personal bank accounts, who appoint loyalists regardless of competence, who demand personal allegiance over institutional integrity, and who govern through chaos and unpredictability rather than consistent policy. The main difference is that today's dysfunctional leaders usually face elections, courts, and media scrutiny rather than just assassination plots, Though whether these modern constraints work better than Roman solutions remains an open and occasionally depressing question. The horse in government metaphor has never been more relevant than in contemporary politics, where unqualified appointments based on personal loyalty rather than expertise have become routine enough that political commentators don't even bother noting individual instances anymore. When cabinet positions go to donors with zero relevant experience, when advisory roles are filled by family members whose qualification is sharing DNA with a leader, when critical agencies are headed by people who actively oppose those agencies' missions, we're not literally appointing horses to consulships, but we're absolutely in the same philosophical territory Caligula occupied. The main improvement is that modern appointees can usually speak and have opposable thumbs, which technically makes them more qualified than incitatus, though their policy outcomes sometimes make that distinction less meaningful than it should be. At least Caligula's horse had the excuse of being a horse. Modern equivalents have Harvard degrees and still somehow produce comparable governance outcomes. The social media age has created conditions where leaders can display Caligula-level narcissism and reality distortion in real time, broadcasting their thought processes, or lack thereof, to millions of followers who then argue about whether what they're witnessing is strategic genius or mental breakdown. Caligula had to settle for declaring himself a god to select audiences in throne rooms and temples. Modern leaders can announce their greatness, attack critics, and share conspiracy theories to global audiences instantly, receiving immediate feedback that ranges from adulation to mockery, depending on which algorithmic bubble you're trapped in. The scale and speed of modern communication means that leadership dysfunction that once took months or years to become apparent now plays out in real-time Twitter threads, which is either progress in government transparency or evidence that some information shouldn't be instantly available to everyone, depending on your perspective and blood pressure medication regimen. The cult of personality that Caligula attempted to build through temples and forced worship has modern equivalents in political rallies, where leaders are treated as infallible, in media ecosystems that refuse to acknowledge any criticism regardless of validity, and in online communities where questioning the leader results in immediate expulsion and accusations of betrayal. The mechanisms are different. We've replaced literal divine worship with metaphorical deification, but the underlying psychology is identical, creating an environment where the leader exists beyond criticism, where loyalty is defined as agreement rather than honest counsel, and where dissent becomes heresy rather than democratic participation. Modern personality cults can't legally force you to worship leaders as gods, but they can absolutely create social and professional consequences for insufficient enthusiasm, which accomplishes similar psychological effects without requiring the theological infrastructure that ancient Rome provided. The financial recklessness that characterized Caligula's reign finds modern expression in deficit, spending disconnected from economic reality, budget proposals that prioritize symbolic projects over functional necessity, and tax policies designed to benefit the leader's personal interests rather than general welfare. We've added sophisticated economic language and complex financial instruments to the process, making it harder for regular citizens to understand when they're being robbed, but the fundamental transaction remains similar. Resources being redirected from public good to personal aggrandizement or political theater. The Bridge of Baiae has contemporary equivalents in infrastructure projects that serve no purpose except demonstrating that the leader can make them happen, in border walls that cost billions and accomplish little, in Space Force branches and other initiatives heavy on symbolism and light on strategic value. At least Caligula's bridge eventually got dismantled and the boats returned to service. Modern boondoggles often become permanent budget items that survive the administrations that created them. The information environment, how truth gets established, challenged, and weaponized, differs dramatically between Caligula's Rome and modern democracies, though not always in directions we'd prefer. Ancient Romans had limited information sources and slow communication, meaning imperial propaganda could control narratives effectively, but also couldn't instantly respond to criticism or mobilize supporters. Modern citizens have access to unprecedented information, but also face unprecedented disinformation, making it simultaneously easier and harder to understand what's actually happening in government. Caligula could declare himself a god, and most Romans would hear about it through official channels. Modern leaders declare themselves geniuses on social media, and millions of people immediately access fact checks, supporting evidence, contradicting information, and conspiracy theories about what the declaration really means. Whether this represents progress depends on whether you think having more information helps when much of that information is deliberately false, and sorting truth from fiction requires time and skills most people lack. The role of expertise and institutional knowledge in government has degraded in ways Caligula would recognize, where career professionals who actually understand how systems work are dismissed as deep state obstacles rather than valued as guardians of institutional memory and competence. Caligula executed or exiled experienced administrators who disagreed with him, replacing them with loyalists. Modern versions accomplish similar outcomes through forced resignations, dismissive tweets, and systematic dismantling of agencies' ability to function effectively. The contempt for expertise that characterized Caligula's reign, the assumption that will and power matter more than knowledge and experience, reappears whenever leaders treat governance as performance art rather than technical challenge requiring specific skills. The horse metaphor works here too. Appointing Incitatus to the Senate says, "Your expertise doesn't matter. Anyone could do your job," which is functionally identical to modern rhetoric about draining swamps and disrupting established systems, except with more explicit animal imagery. The question of mental fitness for office, whether leaders are psychologically capable of handling the job's demands, remains as fraught now as in Caligula's time, except we've added psychiatric vocabulary without solving the fundamental assessment problem. We can discuss narcissistic personality disorder, cognitive decline, or stress-induced decision-making impairment, but we still lack reliable mechanisms for evaluating fitness or removing leaders whose judgment has clearly deteriorated. The 25th Amendment exists in the United States. Impeachment mechanisms exist in various forms globally, but actually deploying these tools requires political will that often doesn't materialize until after catastrophic damage occurs. Caligula's Rome had no formal process for determining fitness, just assassination when things got intolerable, while modern democracies have formal processes that often prove too politically difficult to implement, which might actually be worse because it creates the illusion of safeguards that don't function when needed. The normalization of corruption and norm-breaking happens gradually in ways that make dramatic interventions difficult until crisis points arrive, whether in ancient Rome or modern democracies. Caligula didn't immediately declare himself a god and threaten to make his horse a consul. He escalated incrementally, testing boundaries, discovering that each transgression faced limited consequences, which emboldened the next violation. Modern erosion of democratic norms follows similar patterns. Rules that seemed inviolable get ignored. Nobody stops it. The next violation goes further, and suddenly you're arguing about whether obvious corruption even counts as corruption anymore, because it's become so routine. The boiling frog metaphor applies. By the time you realize the water's lethally hot, you've already been cooking for a while, and jumping out requires admitting you should have jumped earlier, which implicates everyone who tolerated the temperature increase. The media's role in enabling or constraining dangerous leadership differs significantly between Caligula's Rome and contemporary democracies, though whether modern journalism successfully constrains power or just provides theatrical opposition while actual damage continues remains debated. Ancient Rome had no free press. Information flow was controlled by the state and elite gossip networks, meaning Caligula's bizarre behavior was documented but not actively challenged until physical removal became necessary. Modern democracies have robust journalism that can expose corruption, fact-check claims, and hold leaders accountable, except when audience polarization means exposés only reach people already opposed while supporters dismiss everything as fake news. Caligula didn't have to worry about investigative journalism revealing his corruption because investigative journalism didn't exist. Modern problematic leaders don't worry about it because they've successfully convinced their base that journalism itself is the enemy, which might be more effective than simply controlling information flow. The international implications of domestic leadership dysfunction matter more now than in Caligula's Rome. Though Rome's Mediterranean dominance meant their emperor's instability did affect surrounding regions. When the emperor of Rome was clearly insane, neighboring kingdoms and client states had to navigate diplomatic relations carefully, never certain whether they'd receive rational responses or declarations of war against the sea. Modern equivalents see allies questioning commitments, enemies testing boundaries, and international systems destabilizing when major powers behave unpredictably. The difference is scale and speed. Caligula's erratic behavior affected millions across several years. Modern leadership dysfunction can trigger market crashes affecting billions within hours, or military posturing that risks nuclear exchange within days. The stakes have increased dramatically even if the underlying psychology of unstable leadership remains consistent across millennia. The question of whether systems or individuals matter more, whether robust institutions can withstand terrible leaders, or whether leadership quality ultimately determines outcomes, plays out differently in Caligula's Rome versus modern democracies, but remains fundamentally unresolved. Rome's institutions survived Caligula barely, proving that bureaucratic momentum and distributed administration can function despite catastrophic leadership at the top, at least temporarily. Modern democracies pride themselves on stronger institutional safeguards, but we're watching in real time as those institutions face stress tests that reveal weaknesses nobody wanted to discover. The optimistic interpretation is that we've built better systems than Rome had. The pessimistic version notes that we're testing whether those systems actually work against determined assault, and the results so far are mixed at best. Caligula's reign lasted less than 4 years before assassination resolved the problem. Modern dysfunctional leaders can potentially last much longer if democratic mechanisms fail to remove them and extra-constitutional solutions are off the table. So here we stand, 2,000 years after Caligula got stabbed in a palace corridor for pushing every possible boundary simultaneously, having apparently learned some lessons, but not necessarily the most important ones. We've built democracies with checks and balances, established rule of law, created mechanisms for peaceful power transfer, and generally convinced ourselves we're more sophisticated than ancient Romans who let one traumatized young man nearly bankrupt an empire over his feelings about his horse. And yet we keep electing leaders who display remarkably similar patterns. The narcissism, the reality distortion, the contempt for expertise, the personal enrichment disguised as policy, the loyalty demands, the chaos as governing strategy, and we act surprised when these patterns produce predictably terrible outcomes. Maybe the real lesson of Caligula isn't about him specifically, but about us collectively. That humans apparently need to relearn the same lessons about power, accountability, and institutional design every few generations because we're constitutionally incapable of learning from other people's mistakes, insisting instead on making our own versions and hoping for different results. Which brings us to the uncomfortable question. If we could travel back and warn the Romans about what happens when you give absolute power to someone fundamentally unsuited for it, would they listen? And if they wouldn't, why do we think we're any different when we keep making variations of the same mistake, just with better technology and more sophisticated excuses for why this time is totally different and definitely won't end with everyone wondering how we let it get this bad? The final accounting of Caligula's reign, what it cost Rome in treasure, lives, and institutional integrity, reads like an itemized bill for national trauma that nobody wanted but everyone had to pay. The treasury depletion alone represented years of accumulated wealth, taxes collected from millions of citizens across the empire, military spoils from generations of conquest, all burned through in less than 4 years on projects ranging from pointless to actively destructive. Historians estimate he spent approximately 2.7 billion sesterces, roughly equivalent to the entire annual budget that Augustus had carefully managed, on games, building projects, bonuses, and general imperial excess, leaving Claudius to inherit an empire that was functionally broke despite controlling the wealthiest territories in the known world. That's not mismanagement. That's achievement in the opposite direction requiring dedicated effort to bankrupt an entity with Rome's resource base in such a short time frame. The human cost is harder to calculate because ancient sources don't provide comprehensive casualty figures. But between executions of senators, equestrians, and their families, military losses from his pointless campaigns, and deaths from the instability his policies created, we're looking at thousands of direct deaths attributable to his reign. That's thousands of families destroyed, children orphaned, wealth confiscated, lives disrupted beyond recovery. All because one person with unlimited power decided their paranoia, whims, and alleged divine status mattered more than human life or institutional stability. And these are just the direct victims. The indirect casualties from economic disruption, delayed infrastructure maintenance, and administrative chaos probably added thousands more whose deaths can't be directly attributed to imperial policy, but resulted from governmental dysfunction nonetheless. You can't measure this kind of damage in simple numbers because the ripple effects continue for generations, affecting people who weren't even born during Caligula's reign, but grew up in the world his choices created. The institutional damage, the erosion of trust in government, the precedents set for future abuses, the normalization of behaviors that previous generations would have found intolerable, might have been the most lasting cost, even if it's the hardest to quantify in historical records focused on events rather than cultural shifts. Caligula proved that emperors could do essentially anything without immediate consequences, that the Senate was powerless beyond assassination plots, that the Praetorian Guard's loyalty was purchasable, and that Roman legal protections meant nothing when the emperor decided they didn't. Future emperors inherited these lessons along with the throne, understanding that power in Rome was limited only by self-restraint and political calculation, not by constitutional constraints or institutional checks. The temporary nature of Caligula's reign prevented him from completely remaking Roman government, but he demonstrated its vulnerabilities thoroughly enough that subsequent rulers knew exactly which pressure points to exploit when convenient. The psychological legacy for survivors manifested in ways that ancient sources barely acknowledge, but must have profoundly affected Roman political culture for decades afterward. Everyone who'd navigated Caligula's court, who'd survived by anticipating his moods, who'd watched friends and family members executed for imaginary crimes, carried that trauma forward into subsequent reigns. They'd learned that survival required constant vigilance, that honesty was dangerous, that drawing attention risked death, and that the safest strategy was appearing enthusiastically supportive while actually accomplishing nothing that might trigger imperial displeasure. This created a political culture of performative loyalty and actual paralysis, where officials focused more on avoiding blame than achieving results, where innovation was risky and mediocrity was safe. Caligula's reign lasted less than 4 years, but its psychological effects shaped Roman governance for generations, teaching lessons about power and survival that couldn't be unlearned even under better emperors. The religious and cultural implications of his self-deification attempt lingered awkwardly in Roman theology and imperial cult practices, creating tensions that subsequent emperors had to navigate carefully. Caligula had pushed divine claims beyond what Romans considered acceptable, but he'd also established that emperors could make such claims, forcing successors to determine where exactly the boundaries were without formal guidelines. Some emperors ignored divinity entirely, focusing on military and administrative competence instead. Others embraced it carefully, accepting worship after death, but not demanding it while alive. A few doubled down on Caligula's approach and faced similar consequences. The Jewish community's near disaster over the temple statue attempt created lasting wariness about how Roman religious demands intersected with monotheistic faiths, contributing to tensions that eventually exploded in revolt. Caligula hadn't intended to establish precedents for religious conflict, but his narcissistic demands for worship had long-term consequences he never lived to see or care about. The military's relationship with imperial authority shifted after Caligula in subtle but significant ways, as soldiers recognized that their loyalty was a commodity emperors needed and would pay for, not an automatic duty owed to whoever held the throne. The Praetorian Guard's role in proclaiming Claudius emperor after assassinating Caligula established a pattern that would repeat throughout Roman history. Soldiers making and unmaking emperors based on promised rewards rather than legitimate succession. This wasn't entirely new. Military force had always underpinned political power in Rome. But Caligula's reign made it explicit and transactional in ways that previous emperors had tried to obscure with rhetoric about duty, honor, and tradition. Future imperial succession crises would regularly involve military units backing different candidates based on promised bonuses, essentially auctioning the throne to whoever could offer the best compensation package, which is effective for soldier finances but terrible for political stability and governmental legitimacy. The economic recovery from Caligula's fiscal disaster took years of careful management by Claudius, who had to simultaneously restore the treasury, maintain military spending, continue essential services, and avoid the kind of oppressive taxation that would trigger rebellions. Claudius accomplished this partly through more efficient administration and partly through conquest. Adding Britain to the empire brought new resources and tax revenue, while burnishing his military credentials and distracting from domestic problems. The fact that Rome recovered relatively quickly from Caligula's spending spree demonstrates the empire's fundamental economic strength. But it also reveals how much unnecessary damage one person's poor judgment can inflict when unrestrained by fiscal oversight or accountability. Modern economists studying Roman finances note that Caligula's reign represented a completely unnecessary crisis, wasting resources and causing suffering that served no strategic purpose and benefited nobody, except temporarily the emperor's ego and permanently the historians who'd write about his excess for millennia. The architectural legacy, the buildings completed or started during his reign, mostly disappeared through later demolition, neglect, or repurposing, leaving almost no physical trace of his nearly 4 years in power. His temple to himself was never completed and was eventually dismantled. His palace extensions were modified by subsequent emperors to serve actual functional purposes. Even the Bridge of Baiae existed only briefly before being taken apart for materials. This erasure was partly intentional. Damnatio Memoriae included physical removal of the condemned works, but mostly practical. Rome needed functional buildings more than monuments to a disgraced emperor, so Caligula's constructions were recycled into projects that actually served the city's needs. The few surviving structures from his reign are those built for legitimate purposes rather than vanity, demonstrating that what endures isn't what aggrandizes individual leaders, but what serves practical human needs across generations. Caligula wanted to be remembered through magnificent buildings. Instead, he's remembered through texts describing his failures, which is perhaps the universe's way of maintaining cosmic justice. The counterfactual question of what Rome might have accomplished if those resources and years had been directed by competent leadership instead of Caligula's chaos is impossible to answer, but fascinating to contemplate. The money spent on his personal temple could have funded aqueducts bringing water to underserved regions. The Bridge of Baiae's cost could have maintained roads across the empire for years. The administrative attention wasted managing his whims could have been directed toward provincial governance, legal reforms, or economic development. Rome's potential during this period was enormous. It controlled vast territories, had sophisticated engineering and administrative capabilities, commanded wealthy trade networks, and Caligula essentially spent 4 years proving that all that potential could be wasted if leadership was sufficiently dysfunctional. This isn't just ancient history. It's a recurring pattern where societies with tremendous resources and capabilities squander them because leadership prioritizes personal gratification over collective welfare, which should sound grimly familiar to anyone paying attention to contemporary politics. The historical irony that Caligula is among Rome's most famous emperors, more recognizable to average people than many who ruled longer and accomplished more, reveals something about how history remembers leaders. Spectacular failure makes you memorable in ways that competent administration doesn't. Claudius ruled longer, conquered Britain, built infrastructure, reformed administration, and stabilized imperial finances, but ask random people about Roman emperors and they'll probably mention Caligula and maybe Nero before Claudius registers, if he ever does. This creates perverse incentives for anyone seeking historical immortality. Be spectacularly dysfunctional, and you'll be discussed for millennia, whereas govern responsibly, and you'll be a footnote that specialists study. Caligula would probably be pleased to know he's still famous 2,000 years later, though perhaps less pleased that the fame is entirely for being a cautionary tale rather than the divine legacy he imagined during those conversations with the moon. The parallel between Caligula's Rome and our current moment. The similarities in leadership dysfunction, institutional strain, and collective uncertainty about how to respond suggest that we haven't progressed as far from ancient political problems as we'd like to believe. We've added democratic mechanisms, legal frameworks, and constitutional protections that Rome lacked. But we're discovering in real time that these safeguards only work when people choose to enforce them, when political will exists to activate constitutional tools, when enough citizens care more about preserving systems than supporting their preferred leaders. Caligula's Rome had no mechanism for peaceful removal of unfit emperors. We do, theoretically, but deploying those mechanisms requires political courage that often proves scarce when needed. The question isn't whether we have better systems than ancient Rome. We obviously do. But whether we have the collective will to use them before crises escalate beyond peaceful resolution, or whether we'll keep tolerating dysfunction until someone metaphorically gets stabbed in a palace corridor, because all other options have been exhausted or abandoned. The fundamental lesson of Caligula, if we're willing to learn it rather than just being entertained by it, is that systems matter, but leadership matters more. That institutional design provides guardrails, but can't prevent disaster if nobody's willing to grab the steering wheel when the driver's clearly incapacitated. Rome survived Caligula because enough people finally decided his removal was worth the risks, because the conspiracy succeeded before he caused permanent damage, because Claudius proved more competent than anyone expected, and because the empire's bureaucratic foundations were strong enough to function despite catastrophic leadership at the top. We shouldn't rely on being that lucky. We shouldn't assume our institutions will automatically save us from our worst leadership choices. We shouldn't wait until crises become intolerable before activating the safeguards we've built. And we definitely shouldn't convince ourselves that it can't happen here when Caligula's story demonstrates clearly that it can happen anywhere if conditions align and people decide that tolerating dysfunction is easier than confronting it. Which brings us uncomfortably back to the question of whether we're watching history repeat itself in real time or whether this time really is different. Spoiler alert, it usually isn't different, just faster and with better special effects. Which is simultaneously reassuring because it means we know how this story ends, and terrifying because apparently knowing how stories end doesn't prevent us from acting them out anyway with slight variations in different costumes, but fundamentally the same plot beats leading toward predictable conclusions that everyone claims they didn't see coming despite the literally thousands of years of precedent, suggesting exactly this outcome. But sure, let's all act surprised when concentrated power plus insufficient accountability plus leadership dysfunction equals disaster, as if Caligula didn't already provide this lesson in highly entertaining and grotesquely memorable fashion 2 millennia ago, complete with horses in the Senate and emperors arguing with celestial bodies. Because apparently humanity's commitment to learning from experience is roughly equivalent to our commitment to reading terms of service agreements. Technically, we know we should, definitely will regret not doing it, but probably will just click through anyway and hope for the best while mentally preparing explanations for why this time was totally unforeseeable despite all the obvious warning signs we collectively chose to ignore.